get started. My name's Jessie King. I'm the adult ed intern. And today we have Dr. Andy Watts, which I'm really excited about. He is the professor of one of my classes at Belmont. I'm taking servant leadership from him, which has been a really great experience. And he's going to speak with us a bit about mass incarceration and justice. He's been a pastor, he's been a professor for a good long while. He's done a lot of interesting justice work. So we're really excited to have him here.
Good morning, everybody. It's it's good to be here. I have not been in Westminster's buildings or even on the campus before. What a lovely church! It's beautiful. So I'm just so pleased to be here. And thank you, Jesse, for introducing me. Uh, I have supervised two interns at Westminster. A couple of years ago, Elizabeth Snyder was here, and then Jesse King as well. And thank you for hosting and training and developing and guiding these young people, but also thank you for welcoming me into this place today. I really appreciate that. I'm just so happy to be here. One of the things I do before I start talking about anything in my classrooms is tell a dad joke. Can I do that real fast? Okay, because sometimes in these really serious conversations, it's really helpful to shake up the mind a little bit with some humor, right? Okay, so it's a Thanksgiving dad joke. Why did the cranberries turn red? I'm sorry? Okay. Um, well, the other possibility is because they saw the turkey dressing. Ah. Okay, so this is why am I here? I've been invited to be here. I've talked with Guy over the years. I've been waiting to come and talk about my kind of my bully pulpit, if you would, and that is reforming mass incarceration, reforming the prison system. And one of the reasons why I like presenting on this topic is because I've worked teaching in the prison systems in Tennessee since 2009. I've taught conflict resolution and mediation courses on death row at Riverbend. I've taught college courses at Turney Center. The organization I worked with has been Tennessee Higher Education in Prison Initiative, and that organization is based right here in Nashville. They want to bring higher education to prisons because higher education is the number one way to reduce recidivism in prisons more than any other skill training, job training, religious teaching, or mediation. Higher education is that recidivism reducer. And so it's really motivated to get inside of all Tennessee prisons. They have a college program in Turney Center in Only, Tennessee, about 70 miles from here. They have a college program out west and one out east in Tennessee. So three campuses, and now a fourth is coming. Belmont University actually has a 4-year degree for people inside the prison walls, and they can matriculate into our campus when they finish. Those students that do that actually start in THEI's program, Tennessee Higher Education Initiative's program, and they take courses through Nashville State Community College. So they go from an associate degree to Belmont's 4-year degree, and it's a business degree. So Belmont, as to joining many other colleges and universities across the United States, recognize that this helps the community. The number one point is we want to pay attention to how people inside prison return to their communities. Who do we want them to be in terms of their own flourishing and contributions to society? And this is the best way to do this. 80% of people will be returning to their communities after their prison sentence um, within 15, 20 years. And that's really important to recognize. So that's one of the reasons I'm here. The other reason has to do with justice. So I have a PowerPoint today. You can always raise your hand and ask a question about anything I say, about anything I talk about. At the end of the PowerPoint, I hope to play a video, a short 3-minute video from my friend and partner, Reverend Dr. Janet Wolf. Has anybody ever met Dr. Wolf? She is a a pivotal Nashville voice in social justice issues, and she's ordained in the United Methodist Church tradition, has been a pastor. She has also been the faith director of the Children's Defense Fund at Haley Farms in East Tennessee. So hopefully I'll get to play that video. Okay. I have worked in several prisons, and one of the things that I got involved in was trying to eliminate what we call mass incarceration or hyperincarceration. Mass incarceration is a term that signifies the accumulation of a large number of people in prison in a very quick time. If I can get this slide over. Hyperincarceration is the targeting of certain groups of people by class and race inside this buildup of the prison population. And that targeting is one that I use the word targeting not to imply a direct individual or societal targeting, but the targeting of the actual emphasis on certain groups of people. And I'll explain that in a minute. For example, this buildup begins in the 1960s. And I'm going to go through a timeline because I think the history is important. We have over 2 million people incarcerated in our prisons and jails in the United States right now. It was 2.3 million, but when President Obama and then President Trump decided to reform drug sentencing practices, then those folks who are in on drug charges, that's 1 in 5 people in our prisons and jails, were given reduced sentences or their sentences were vacated. And so that reduced the prison population. And then that also reduced the state's output in terms of finances for housing these people. So since 2013, 14, the prison population has begun to drop. In 1880, 1 in 1,600 people was in prison, mostly jails in 1880. In 1960, 1 in 800 people in the United States was in prison, and these were prisons, not mostly jails, but some jails. In 2015, 1 in 200 people was confined in a jail or prison, mostly prisons, mostly state prisons. Some in federal prisons, but mostly state prisons. That's an enormous shift right there in terms of percentages. And so scholars and practitioners started asking why this shift happened. And I want to explain the reasons why and some of the history of why this happened at the beginning of this talk. And then I want to get into a Christian response to maybe the damages that have been created by this buildup of people and population inside our prisons. Any questions or comment before I go on to this next box? Oh, yes. That's a really good question. So outsourcing prison management in the academy is addressed through the idea of privatized or privately owned prisons. One of those organizations is here in Nashville. That's Core Civic. Those organizations began in the 1980s because of overcrowding in prisons. And so some really successful entrepreneurs said we can actually help and take advantage of this situation. So we have private prisons developed. Privatized prisons are ones that are either owned by an organization or built by the organization. We call those speculation prisons. They look ahead to how many people they think they will be incarcerated in 5 to 10 years. So they build a prison and let it sit there for a while till that population increases. But mostly it's management, like you said. Some scholars believe it does increase the prison population because the contracts that privatized prisons make with states mostly have addendums and kind of agreements within them that say, we will manage your prisons as long as you can guarantee that 90 to 95% of our beds are filled. So when a state says, yes, we contract to at least fill 90% of your beds in the prison, that means they're contracted to send people into prison, right? And how do you do that? Yeah, through the justice system and through the legislative system as well. So many scholars want to really dive into that kind of agreement. Now, you'll hear two sides of the story, one from the privatized corporations and one from the scholars. Then you'll hear another one from the government. I think that non-government actors, that it might be unethical for non-government actors to punish people for for the electorate, for the citizenry of the United States. Only officials should be able to do that according to law, I think. But that's my own little, you know, side issue that I think is important to bring, and other scholars do too. Great question. Thank you for that. Anybody else? All right. Incarceration. We talked about that. This rate up until 2015. I don't know if you can see these numbers. I'll read them to you today. So 1.9 million are in prisons and jails today as we speak. It's creeping up again because of the pandemic, mental illness from the pandemic, as well as economic reasons arising from the pandemic, the kind of shift in economic opportunities and jobs. There are 4.9 formerly incarcerated people in the United States, 4.9 million. 19 million American citizens have been convicted of a felony at some time. 19 million. 79 million or more American citizens have a criminal record. And then 113 million adults have an immediate family member who has ever been to prison or jail. 1 in 11 people in the United States, more than any other country in the entire world, have somebody in their immediate circle who's been incarcerated. And they're either out on probation or they're on parole. That's a very high number, higher than any developed country in the world, much higher than some undeveloped countries, some countries of the South in the world. And that's one reason scholars started paying attention, because with incarceration, you have what we call collateral damage. And that affects communities, families, children, economic opportunities in certain zones and localities. It damages a culture, regional cultures and broader cultures, as we can see in the United States. And it actually, as we've seen, targets a certain group of individuals, mostly poor people. And the reason why they're targeted, by targeting, I mean they show up more often than other people inside prisons. Does that make sense? They're targeted in a way because they just can't afford, they don't have the resources to afford the kind of litigation that most other people can go to stay out of prison. Questions or comments with those numbers? Anything that you see that surprises you or you want to talk about? Right. A criminal record could be a misdemeanor record, but a felony record is one that has a serious sentence to it that requires incapacitation time, incarceration time. Still, with some felonies, you don't have incarceration. You have probation sentences, and that's where folks have time served in a jail, and they don't have to go to prison while they're awaiting trial, but they're put on probation. That probation can take a long time, decades for some people. That's a great question. Thanks for that. Anybody else? So I just want to go through this timeline. I will not give you a quiz on this, although I have brought some books, and one of the books, Elizabeth Hinton's book, focuses on how policy since the 1960s created this mass incarceration issue that we have. 1964. In the 1960s, a lot of upheaval events were happening in the United States, right? We had the end of the Korean War before that. We have the beginnings of the Vietnam War. We have a Catholic president inaugurated and then assassinated. President Johnson, his vice president, becomes the president of the United States. The civil rights movement is happening. Women's rights movements are happening. Many different things. In 1964, the government under President Johnson, but it started with President Kennedy, started to focus on urban centers, primarily Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Houston. Urban centers where the most diversity of the population occurs in the inner city, and then it seems that crime rates were rising in the 1960s in those urban centers. So Johnson's administration declares the war on poverty because sociologists at the time developed some research-driven opinions on the causes of poverty and its relationship to crime. And one of the things these sociologists decided was that um, Black and brown Americans were caught in this web of poverty and crime more than other Americans, and those who were poor as well, because of what they described discriminatory laws in the United States. For example, redlining in real estate industries, where people who were Black and brown either had their houses devalued, undervalued, or were prohibited from moving into a section of town where they might get some assets that were greater. In fact, in Nashville, redlining occurred below the belt up until the late 1960s, even though it was outlawed. So this war on poverty decided, the conclusion was that there was something wrong innately with the Black American family. They said it was cultural. And so the government started to want to address, the federal government wanted to start to address this idea of culture, and they think that it came from, centuries of slavery, the lack of assets, the breakup of the family attached to the chattel slave trade. And so they wanted to see if they could repair that. What happens when you get a bunch of smart people in a room working for the federal government? Then sometimes they're overzealous about one issue and they start working in outside of their blind sides. And I think that's exactly what happened. Now, Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act to help cement into law rights for Black and brown Americans, end discrimination in so many levels. And then in 1965, he declares the war on crime with this thing called the Law Enforcement Assistance Act. And this is when the federal government decided that local and municipal, regional police departments should be the front line, not only officers, but social workers in the war against poverty. What happens when a police officer is told to also be a social worker and a community liaison? Those are some conflicts of interest, aren't they? So what you start seeing is that the social issues that needed to be implemented started to be replaced by legal law enforcement practices. And the Law Enforcement Assistance Act started to prepare these police forces by giving them not only equipment, but started to train them through military strategies and tactics into the late 60s. So you have this really interesting, well-intentioned, please hear me, this idea of trying to eliminate poverty and crime in the inner city. The Voting Rights Act becomes law in 65. Then we have the Watch riots in Los Angeles in 1965. And that broke the back of the social theory that the federal government had been relying upon. And so this tough on crime attitude came into being, especially with Los Angeles' response to the Watts riots. And that response was brutal. The Watts riots occurred because of a police action against two of its male citizens, young male citizens. That community had tried to vie to have some ownership in the policies that affected its own community for a long time, but they were locked out of city government, locked out of county government, and locked out of state government because of discrimination. One of the best ways that we can help take care of people is listen to their voices. They know what's best for themselves. But the Watts neighborhood was kept out of that. So when these two young men were unlawfully or at least wrongfully frisked and injured, the community had no recourse. Its voices were not listened to. And so the riots occurred. The riots in Watts, which turned Watts into a military zone with the National Guard, led to the Gun Control Act 3 years later. Congress and state government started saying, we need to take guns out of the inner city. Unfortunately, this Gun Control Act really only targeted a specific group of people. Young, poor, mostly black and brown because of being young and poor in inner city people. So the Gun Rights Act itself was unintentionally discriminatory. But I think that people knew exactly what the effects would be, if that makes sense. I'll stop right here. Questions or comments? Okay, I know it's history, and I know, at least at Belmont, history is a sleeper, but I'm going to keep going, okay? And by the way, the buildup of people inside prisons has been a bipartisan event. We have Democrat presidents and Republican presidents involved in this. And so students are often surprised to hear that. They either have one opinion or another opinion on that. So Nixon launches the war on drugs because some of the crime is coming from a buildup in drugs in the 1960s in these inner cities. We have cross-the-border drug movement coming into our inner cities at enormous amounts in the late 1960s. So Nixon launches this war on drugs, and he creates the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. And this DEA uses militaristic style strategies and tactics and passes them on to local police departments. The Law Enforcement Act actually gave grants to local enforcement agencies to buy all the military equipment for very, very, very low cost that was coming back from Vietnam. So you saw military equipment show up in local police forces inside inner city limits. So what you can imagine is that young people in the inner city grew up, I would like to say, seeing the same thing that Jesus saw when he was a young boy. Jesus would walk the road from Nazareth to Sepphoris and see people executed on crosses all the way down the road. That was happening all the time. So you see that violence in the inner city in the 1960s and 70s. And you know what that means. You're formed by it. You're shaped by it. So Nixon is often considered one of the worst of the offenders because he really took this hard stance, very tough stance on crime, and he threw away any kind of sociological theory for understanding the origins of crime and poverty at the same time. He just said, we got to make America safe. And there's some validity to that, right? Scholars don't say that's not needed, but when you just completely dismiss some of the symptoms of the things you're trying to heal by ignoring the social consequences, the social factors, then what happens is that certain populations of people experience the most brutal of the answers. So Nixon forms, let's see, from Nixon we go to Carter. Jimmy Carter, he really wanted to return to social policy, but he did something that was very not helpful. He ignored the density issues. During the Johnson administration, public housing started to develop at a rapid pace in the inner city, and that created a lot of density. Then you added Nixon's policing and surveillance tactics, and so you had density plus surveillance. Carter knew that that was a problem. All the scholars and politicians were saying, we have to eliminate these dense housing projects. What he did was he just tore some down and didn't replace them with a valid or viable answer. So his heart was in the right place, but his mind left the planet on that one, in my words. And his administration was more focused on perhaps an election at times. So we go to Reagan. Reagan is also one of the worst of the offenders, along with Clinton. Okay, so you have Nixon, Reagan, and Clinton. These three presidents are seen as some of the worst offenders. Reagan signs comprehensive crime control and drug abuse programs into law. And what those do is they then let officers infiltrate our schools in large amounts. SROs, and by the way, my kids graduated from Overton, and we loved the SRO there. We loved them. So when we talk about these people inside schools, we're not talking about the individuals, we're talking about the system. Does that make sense? So then we have schools mostly in the inner city with officers and teachers patrolling the hallways all the time. And the officers were also social workers and community liaisons inside the school. Again, there's some conflict of interest because in one moment they can help you find uh, something that you need, and the next moment they'll handcuff you and put you in the car. Um, Sheep in wolf's clothing is something that some folks who've been incarcerated have said about SRO officers, not the individuals, the systems. That make sense? Please hear me say that. I have to remind students, we don't talk about individuals. We talk about systems and structures and policy and history, okay? Because on one level, and you might disagree with this, but we all have dirty hands on one level. And then, as Jesus says, if you cast the first stone if you're without sin, right? That kind of saying. I don't want to make that too light. So Reagan goes on and signs the Drug Abuse Act. In the 1990s, we have three strikes laws and truth in sentencing come into being. Do y'all know what three strikes laws are? Yeah, so in states like California and New York, if you have three felonies in a row, then you are accountable for life in prison. Um, and truth in sentencing means that there's no option for early release, no, no parole for good behavior. You got to serve out the sentences on the books. So this comes to being in 1993. Then Clinton in 1994 signs the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which makes all these harsh laws federal policy, and then also he repeals all Pell Grants. So in 1994, there's no more government funding for college education inside prisons. And Clinton signs this, and he wanted to be known as the tough on crime president, and he was with this law. Soon after this, he passed another law about welfare, the Welfare Reform Act. The effects of that Welfare Reform Act have been disastrous for women, particularly in lower income quintiles. Disastrous, having to work and raise children at the same time. That mandate has been very harmful. Clinton has said he regrets doing those things, but the damage happened from both of those. And mass incarceration just accelerates with that. 9.1% in 1 year between 1993 and 1994. That's nearly a 10% increase. And that's just too much. Way too much. 27 states in 1997 have truth in sentencing, and they get some big federal grants for maintaining these laws. So there's incentive to be, my word is draconian, but other people say, maybe a little over the top in their sentencing policies and laws. In 2014, National Academy of Sciences releases a report on mass incarceration, and then we start to see a reduction in 2014. Questions or comments with that? It's mostly, the source of the reduction is mostly attending to drug crimes, drug sentencing, and drug policies. In the United States, we see more states where marijuana is legal now, and then you have marijuana in other states can be used for medicinary purposes. So that's the point of reduction starting in 2014. Good question. try to answer questions like that, I want to always remember that life in prison and death row means that there are serious injuries to victims. And we always remember that. I work in restorative justice, and the first principle of restorative justice is to address the victim, if they're alive or their family. Does that make sense? So, that said, death row. Many people believe that there should be no programs for rehabilitating people on death row because they'll never get out. Since I've worked on death row in Riverbend Prison, starting in 2013, we've had 4 men released from death row. Their sentences have been vacated. They've been changed. In the United States, 1 in 9.5 or 9 people on death row is most likely, highly likely innocent of the conviction that they have. It doesn't mean that they're innocent of something else, but they're innocent of that conviction. Brian Stevenson says, an interesting proposition, would you ever fly in an airplane again if you knew that 1 in 10 would crash? Why do we tolerate that kind of risk and percentage for executing people if we are unwilling to tolerate that kind of risk in other areas of our lives? Yeah. That's a great question again, and so it's the only argument that I have that can persuade a consensus of people, in my opinion, because people have different moral opinions on capital punishment. They have different practical opinions on capital punishment, although it's been proven to deter nothing. So yeah, on death row in Riverbend, we run a conflict mediation circle, and we have for years. And that conflict mediation circle teaches a group of self-selected men how to learn about themselves, about their emotions, how they affect their social life, and to deal with the brutal environment of prison. This conflict resolution circle was taught Tennessee law, Rule 31 mediation, a program coming out of Lipscomb University. And it was a certificate program. And by the end of this, the administrators inside the prison relied on this group of men to resolve the violent conflicts often inside their unit, so that death row in this area in 2A becomes the safest units in Tennessee prisons. So we empowered people to take care of themselves, even though they'll never be released again. And my view is that somebody on death row never doesn't have a vocation. Although the public wants people inside prison walls to think that they no longer count, that they don't have vocations or purposes. We want to make sure that you always have a purpose. And the fact that some will be released is even more incentive. Great question. Thank you for that. Anybody else? Okay. I mentioned I work in restorative justice. I put up here on the slide 5 different biblical precedents for helping Christians think about what it means to punish. When I come back in the spring, hopefully I will, I'm going to talk about life on the inside of prison. And I'm going to give you some data, and we'll talk about that, and maybe that'll connect with Easter in some way, and Advent. But I want to talk about restorative justice and transformative justice. In Genesis 9, after the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah and the animals. There's 2 covenants there. In the covenant that God makes with Noah, God says, if blood be shed by a human, then the one who sheds the blood their blood will be shed by a human as well. And so most Christians say, okay, that means that's a defense for capital punishment. When somebody kills, you kill them. Many scholars think that actually what God is saying is that I'm no longer going to kill. I killed in the flood, it's over. If his killing's going to be done, it's by humans. I don't know how to read that passage correctly. I mean, there's just so many different variations. But it sticks in the mind of contemporary Christians that it's a justification for capital punishment, right? This kind of commandment to Noah's family, this covenant. The sixth commandment, no killing or murder. It's so interesting. Sometimes in the King James, it says, thou shalt not kill, but in contemporary versions, it's thou shalt not murder. And these contemporary versions arise after the 20th century when the weapons of mass destruction developed and these great wars come along. I think Christians wanted to make sure that soldiers aren't held accountable for killing in war. Does that make sense? So they retranslate it as murder. It's used for both in the Old Testament. It means murder and killing at the same time in different passages. But there's an idea of intent. So the law focuses on intent based on what the context is or what the precedent is. The lex talionis, the law of retaliation. Jesus says in Matthew 5, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. A lot of Christians interpret that as you punish somebody proportionally or with the same kind of injury that they perpetrated on somebody else. The lex talionis is an ancient law. It goes back to Mesopotamian peoples, Persian Empire, etc., etc. You find it in Hammurabi's code. This law was not a permissive law. It was a restrictive law. Its purpose is to say, you can't take more than an eye for an eye. You can't take more than a tooth for a tooth. So it's really a law about the death penalty and retaliation on several levels, because sometimes we interpret it as saying, even though Jesus said, you've heard it said, I say, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, we still think eye for an eye is the way to distribute justice, retributive justice primarily. John 8, the woman caught in adultery. This is a famous passage that many scholars use to repudiate the death penalty. Jesus didn't say, okay, you should now kill her. Y'all know that story? She's caught in adultery. The religious leaders bring her before Jesus, but not the man, wherever he is, and say, she's been caught in adultery. She needs to be stoned. Jesus writes in the sand, and he looks up and says, okay, go the first of you without sin, go ahead and cast the first stone. And they all walk away. And Jesus says, where are your accusers? Go away, don't sin no more. Live your life. Don't sin anymore. What's so interesting to me is that this is not, to me, more of a repudiation of the death penalty. What it is that Jesus acknowledges the context in which many people are falsely charged. Jesus knows the status of women in that society. It is unlawful for a woman to be seen by herself in public. Women cannot touch men, and men who are not their brothers, fathers, or husbands. Women who are experiencing a menstrual cycle are excluded from community. And women who are widows are excluded from community as well because they have little participation in society. When this woman was brought by herself without the other partner to Jesus, Jesus knows the status of women. And so he confronts what I call patriarchy. And these religious leaders walk away, maybe because they know it in their heart. So yes, it might be a repudiation of the death penalty, but I think it's a repudiation of, or it's actually a recognition of the context of judgments and claims by people that lead to some kind of criminal punishment. Any questions or comments with those? Okay, then there's Romans 13 with Paul. Political authority, obey the authorities, right? The word for authority in Greek is exousia, and ousia is the word for essence, like in the idea of the nature of the Trinity. Ousias are the essences of God, and then the existence, existentia, which is the Latin, is the way these ousias exist. The authorities, the exousia, are only authorities because they actually mirror God. So Paul's not talking maybe about, scholars disagree, obeying all authorities, but obeying those authorities that reflect God's character and nature, God's essence. And these only come from God. We know there are authorities who are corrupt. We know there are authorities who are bad actors. There have always been that way. Paul's not necessarily saying you have to obey those, but he does say, let's make peace, right? Christians are to be about peace. This has to do with the idea of obligation. What obligations do Christians feel like they have in terms of criminal justice? Oftentimes, it's just to sit and obey the laws that are in the books. And we can view that how we want, but I think if we move on to the idea of Jesus' teachings about community, we might think something different. All right. Before I move on, we got 10, 15 minutes, something like that. Questions? Trying to develop a little narrative here about how I think Christians might respond to this mass incarceration issue because it's starting to climb again. Yeah, Steve. The retributive side, the retribution is important because it vindicates the rights of the individuals who are harmed. And that's important. And it's how you do it is the question that we're asking. I'm not against punishment. I'm for punishment. It's how we do it is the question. And I think Christians should be concerned with that word, how. So, yes, I think they exist together in the same universe. Does that help? Do you have a thought on that? Hmm. Right. It's not. It's not. This is why continuous reflection must happen, especially in faith circles, in faith environments. Okay. The idea of the individual in the community. Our justice system is based upon the rights of the individual, protected in the Constitution. It's a representative and aggressive and adversarial system because it wants to bring justice to perpetrators of law. Victims don't have a final say in, usually, most of the time, in the actual outcome, the conviction and the sentencing, although you can have family and victim statements in trials. The government steps in and represents the victim in any criminal case. That's our system. That focus on the individual is not biblical. The justice in the Bible was always communal. Always. And that's something that we contemporary Christians forget, especially in Western countries. I like to say that the Hebrew people acted more like an indigenous community than a modern community. So we can't project onto, in my opinion, their practices, certain practices and standards that we find normal in our society. And so students ask me, what do you mean? Well, I turn to, like, for example, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. When he implemented the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa in 1994, he did so based on a principle called Ubuntu. Has anybody heard of the principle called Ubuntu? It's a Zulu word and a Xhosa term too in South Africa, and it means I am not me without you, and you are not you without me, and we're neither of us are individuals without the community, but the community can't exist without the individuals. It's a complete reciprocity of individual and community. And Tutu said that in Western nations, you have such a high priority on the individual that community suffers. In some countries, though, you have such a high priority on community that individuals suffer. There's a balance there that you have to serve. There is something like that in the Old Testament. The technical term for justice in the Old Testament is mishpat, and that's my first word at the top. It means judgment. It means verdict, law, a principle based on character. It can apply to governing authority, and it references the character of God because the character of God is the very foundation of all justice in Hebrew and Israelite society. It grounds the Hebrew concept of authentic, faithful exercise of governing authority. And what's so interesting, that governing authority could be the family, the judicial structures, the royal court like David and Solomon, economic tribunals and groups, or religious offices and institutions. So mishpat applies to all those elements of society. Justice. It's this reflection of God's character. Secondly, justice appears more as a moral principle or idea in the way it's used by the prophets and in the book of Psalms. Justice, most scholars do not think that the strict punishments that we see in Leviticus um, and we see in Deuteronomy were actually ever applied, because law in that day and time acted more as a moral instructor. John Calvin talks about the effects of law as a teaching moment for our sin. Those punishments on the books were more teaching moments for the moral character of the community, most scholars say, at least the ones that I read. So this idea of mishpat is something I think that's very important. It's very interesting, because if it's a moral idea, then we need to look at some of the places where it's used. Let's see if I can get to this now. Oftentimes, the Hebrew word mishpat is used with four other words to kind of frame this idea of its moral understanding. Justice is framed with tzedakah, which means righteousness. And by the way, righteousness, I always was taught that righteousness means that I can be self-assured of my salvation. Self-assurance, right? That's not the meaning of tzedakah, righteousness in Hebrew. The meaning of righteousness in Hebrew is wholeness in human relationships. We are, if we're righteous, forming the type of people and community that God has determined us to do. We're able to come stand, to quote Paul, when we're righteous, we can come before God. God has permitted it, not because of our assurance of salvation, but because we reflect God's character in all of our lives. That's why we can come stand before God in the courtroom of heaven. Berit is covenant. It's a framework for mediating God's character. Shalom is wholeness and peace, and it's a witness to justice. When I've gone to Israel, you say shalom when you enter or leave. Relationships or people, you're actually witnessing to their well-being at all times when you say the word shalom. Peace means more than simply absence of conflict. It's a positive term for well-being. And then chesed is loving kindness and distributive justice. Distributive justice is really the distribution of resources that a society has to all people for their flourishing. So at the very center of the idea of justice, mishpat, are these four terms that actually center the community, not the individual. Wholeness in all relationships, the well-being of all, justice for all. Jesus, when he teaches, comes from this tradition, not the Stoic or the Platonic tradition of Greek philosophy. He comes from this tradition. So whenever he talks about individuals, in the background is always the community. N.T. Wright, the great biblical scholar, says that Jesus' mission was to provide redemption for Israel. It was the removal of sin from the people of God. And yes, that includes individuals, but it just wasn't focused on the individual, which I think is just a reflection of this communal nature of justice in the Bible. So when we talk about retribution, it's not something that we should dismiss, but when you frame it in terms of the community's health, it becomes something different. And that leads me to talk about, in the New Testament, the word is dikaiosune. It comes from the Greek word dikos. Righteousness and justice are they interplay with one another in the New Testament at all times. So if you see the word righteous in Paul's language, know that he has justice in mind, a just character, just actions. Okay, so I want to move on to restorative and transformative justice. Got a couple of minutes. We practice this conflict resolution circle. It's restorative justice because it does face-to-face meetings with people, and we work on their flourishing and restoring them to, rehabilitating them to some kind of level of humanity that the prison system and also their own actions have taken away, right? Restorative justice is often a practice used in the criminal justice system. It applies in other circles as well, but it's often a practice used in the criminal justice system, and it does so by the use of diversionary programs and then COSAs, or communities of support and accountability. Restorative justice is letting the community decide what a punishment should be. First, the victim has to participate and permit this diversion, this alternative practice to happen, and then the victim's family, and then everybody else involved in that must agree to come and work out between themselves the punishment that should be laden upon somebody who's committed a harm. So it's face-to-face, non-adversarial decision-making dialogue between victims, offenders, community members in response to a specific crime or incidents of harm. There's never not simply one victim of a crime. Somebody else is always affected to different degrees. A family member, a child, a parent, a neighbor, the family members of other people involved and hurt. There are concentric outward-facing circles of harm in every single crime, especially violent crimes, mostly. Those affected by crime are empowered to respond, something they're not empowered to do in the courtroom. They get to have their voices heard in these restorative justice circles. Conversations are facilitated but not controlled. You do have experts. Courts appoint people, dialogue facilitators. The prosecutor has to agree to this, so does the judge, and there has to be a legal precedent or at least ability to do this in certain states. So you have restorative justice practices happening all over the United States. And of course, in the most violent of crimes of first-degree and second-degree murder and some homicides where there's no longer a victim, they're almost impossible. They don't always work. They're not appropriate for every situation. But when they're possible and when they're appropriate and when they can work, recidivism rates go way down, way down. Communities seem healthier, and victims families and community members feel more justified in their own rights and justice. It's a powerful thing. Empowerment, inclusion, interests and needs of other parties not involved take a backseat, which doesn't happen in the courtroom sometimes. You have non-participating or non-interested parties affecting sometimes the proceedings. Questions with restorative justice before we go to transformative justice in one little slide. Okay, so I'm really interested in transformative justice because it is restorative justice with teeth. Well, let me go back. I don't know what happened. Let's see. All right. Let's just go from there. Transformative justice. It has distinct practices of education and increased consciousness. What we've learned is that restorative justice attends to the parties that are directly affected by the harm or injury. Transformative justice looks at some of the things that contribute to the crime. For example, in communities, for example, in Tennessee, hospitals are disappearing from counties. They have been for what, 8 years now? 6 years? What effect does that systemic reduction of medical care, how does that contribute to crime? Maybe somebody that needs mental health care and can no longer get it and can't make the journey to get it. That loss of structure or system contributes to the increase of some types of crime, perhaps. This is what transformative justice looks at. What breakdown or loss of or absence of systems and structures affects the crime rates of particular crimes that happen? And how can we stop that by addressing the systems and structures? And then some of those systems and structures are punitive to certain groups of people. People at low income levels, people who are black and brown in the United States traditionally. That's changing a lot now, thank goodness, right? That's really changing. But it's still there in some ways. I've experienced it myself in the last 10 years traveling across the United States. These racial dynamics are just pernicious sometimes. They crop up when you don't expect them to. So transformative justice looks at systems and structures to see if we can head off the situation that develops where people commit harms. And of course, some people commit harms for a lot of other reasons as well. Bad choices, situations, environments, all that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? The reason why I want to focus on those is because they focus on community and the individual at the same time. Community has not gotten lost in the criminal justice system. It actually is at the very forefront of it. And I think that's very biblical. And I think Jesus would approve. All right, that's my slideshow for today. Any questions or comments? Mhm. So my comment about that is, number one, I think that it is the detention centers that have been leased to or built by private prison companies, those detention centers, like other private prisons, privately owned prisons, are run in a way that is deficient to government run facilities. And of course, it helps with profit. I can't comment on every single detention facility. The very fact that immigrants waiting to be deported or immigrants coming in are a profit possibility or a profit adventure, to me, has a moral edge to it that I think needs to be investigated more thoroughly by Christians, especially. Do you have a comment on that? Yeah, yeah. Um, I, I've been a part of a group called the Alliance of Higher Education in Prisons, and we think that private prison corporations should not exist. We're not saying that private companies can make contracts with prisons to provide phones, food, healthcare, things like that. But the actual management and administration of punishment, in my opinion, should come from uh, constitutionally not not only elected but oathed officers. I think that's a difficult. It's a line that's blurry to me, and it's not to say that there's good stuff that happens in private prisons too. That's not what that's saying. I think in principle there needs to be a change. Okay, that's a good question. At Turney Center, we have a class of about 30 to 40 per year. So we have a rotation right now, I think, of 100 to 120 men, and they're not all getting out of prison soon. So the prison actually has a input into who can join college classes like our program. They have to have good behavior. They have to have been somebody that looks like they're trying to do a good job rehabilitating themselves. They have to have a GED in place. That means they have to have one going into prison or have a high school diploma or having passed the GED courses that the prison offers. Percentage-wise, it's a small percentage in terms of the prison population. I would say at Turney Center, which is a very large facility, maximum security facility, probably 10%, 8 to 10% have participated. I know a lot more have wanted to participate. Does that help? Right. So it, with the college education that THEI offers down at Turney Center that Belmont participates in and offers a 4-year degree, they have a pre-education program, training and mentoring program, then have a reentry training and program. So it's a before, during, and after comprehensive uh, program caring for people inside prison, which is so important. At Riverbend, we do teach classes in other units besides death row. On the low side, units 5 and 6, they're large sentences, they're tough sentences there. But these guys, we have probably 15, 20 people in classes every year, which is good. We've had two. I've been there in a room where two drug gang leaders have sat together where they wouldn't talk to each other they come and talk to each other and they say, we got to work it out. That's powerful when that happens. Good question. Anybody else? That's a good question. I give students an article from 2014 from the New Yorker about two families whose children were going to marry each other, and they were engaged, and they weren't getting along. They started fighting one day at one of their houses, and there was a gun there, and they were normally a really good couple, and there was a gun grab for some reason, and the man ends up shooting the woman, and she dies. These two families were really, really close. I mean, tight, tight friends. But this devastated them, right? One one family lost their daughter. Another family is going to lose a son to prison and life. One of their priests said that they know some restorative justice people and to contact them. They did, and they appealed to the state of New York to use restorative justice circle uh, practices instead of the court system. The judge said yes, and the prosecutor said yes because of the situation. Two close friend families, two people who loved each other. It looked like it wasn't an accident, but you can't tell. So the jury's probably going to come out with murder on that one. They did restorative justice circles. The two families, after a year or two, are now great friends, and they're both working for the flourishing of their son, of this boy, who is in prison, but he's not going to be there anywhere as long as he would have been. And he wasn't sent to the most violent units. So that worked in a certain kind of way. Does that make sense? That's the extreme case that I know of. We practice it too, and I think I've seen it work, but I can talk more about that when I come back in the spring. Thanks for coming today. Yeah, have a good Sunday.